So in terms of ungrading, I would hardly call myself an expert in this, but I would hardly call myself an expert in almost anything. So I am someone who has done ungrading quite a lot and am ready to talk about it in many different ways. So let's begin by checking in. I always do a check-in, especially as we're in the midst of a pandemic, a global pandemic still. Really would love to know how you are doing this week. And I'm going to open up the chat for that moment. You can just put in A, B, C, D, E, whatever answer suits you best right now in the chat. If you don't want to own an answer, you can just think about where you are and how you feel about things right now. Okay, so part of what a talk requires is some centering and some focus. And so let's take a moment for a deep breath just to kind of center and focus ourselves, to kind of get into the place where we can really think and understand what's going on in this talk. And if we have questions, be able to share them. So here's a picture of a New Mexico sunset. This is from the Sandia Mountains, which are called the Sandias because they are watermelon colored in the sunset. And so this is a view towards the city. If you want to take a few deep breaths, and remember that we're here and we're trying to pay attention, even though this might be our 20th Zoom meeting today. All right. I love questions. I love things to talk about. This is just a pattern of a talk that I thought about. It is, of course, interruptible, especially in the chat. So please ask your questions if you have them. All right, a little bit about me just for 2 minutes here. I'm essentially tenured faculty at my institution. I teach both chemistry and statistics. I'm not teaching statistics right now because I have some real disagreements with the way testing is done. We can talk about that later if you're really interested. I have 2 master's degrees, one in organic chemistry and one statistics. I'm kind of an anomaly in the organic chemistry world. And I am working on my PhD in learning sciences at the University of New Mexico. I've taught at CNM since 2002, 3 semesters a year, 5 classes each semester. You all understand the quarter system very well. So I've taught about 290 classes. Maybe I'm on 295 at this point. Where I'm the teacher on record. I also do talks and stuff all over the country, but the digital pedagogy lab is the only thing that I hyperlinked because I really like that. And that is in fact past Twitter where I met Renee for real. So yay. I also have some books. I'm in the Ungrading book by Susan Blum, who edited that book. It's a collection of chapters by different authors. And quite a lot of different things that you can look at if you're interested in looking me up later, including where to find me. I'm on Twitter, and I have a blog on ChemEdX as well as my website. Okay, I want you to take a moment and just check in one more time, kind of think about where you are in terms of grading, traditional grading, specifications grading, or ungrading. You may have been here previous weeks, you may not have. There's been a lot of discussion about specifications grading. Today will not be a discussion about specifications grading. So in terms of asking questions, I probably will defer those questions to the people who have far more experience in that. That means Renee and Steve, you will be on the hook for those. But if you have questions about ungrading or any other kind of grading, I can try to answer them. So the question is, why ungrade? Well, there are certainly quite a lot of reasons to ungrade, but I think that this was from a Journal of Chemical Education, so it's patterned towards chemists, but it can really be towards anyone in any field that inviting students to be engaged and active social participants in their own educational journey and validating their backgrounds and identities empowers learning and builds relationships. And these are things that we want in our classrooms. So what are the problems with grading? Well, let's think about how we typically view students. Now, admittedly, A lot of folks really work hard on making students, seeing them as three-dimensional human beings in their courses. And that's awesome. I'm not necessarily talking to you. I'm actually talking to a version of myself that existed about 10 years ago, where this is actually how I thought about students, right? You could be three-dimensional to me in lab or in lecture, but ultimately you were cells on my spreadsheet where I filled in the grades. And this is actually how LMSs also think about students. And so when we think about those constraints of what a cell on a spreadsheet mean, or even a row of cells on a spreadsheet means, you might think about what grades are, right? What do grades define for us in terms of our students? Grades are unidimensional at best. I think they really oversimplify the complexity and the nature of academic learning. And when you think about what goes into a grade for a student for you, it may be part of this list. There is actually a huge list that is much longer than this, that talks about what all of the different things that teachers have claimed to put into their grades before. So they are an inexact measure by any stretch of the imagination. As a critical pedagogue, as someone who really loves critical pedagogy, I did not give myself the name critical pedagogue, by the way. That was something that Sean Michael Morris told me one day. In terms of this, there are three key arguments against grades when you think about a classroom as a participant democracy. And really, these are ones that I think are important to understand, at least in terms of the way that I come to ungrading. They are competitive. They really promote competition and detached individualism. Grading undermines the principles of dialogic engagement and critical questioning of authority figures. It does all kinds of things. These are just some of the things that grades do. But I think that the authoritative moment, by the way, that was me pointing down for my wife to go tell my son to turn it down a bit. So it won't be as loud anymore. The idea here is that dialogical engagement and critical questioning of authority figures is part of participant democracy. If you choose to have your classroom as one of those. If you aren't in that place, then maybe these speak to you or not. But this last one, I think, speaks to everyone. It really undermines intrinsic motivation. We, by definition, want our, well, not by definition, but by poll after poll after poll after poll and survey after survey, higher ed professors want their students to be critical thinkers, self-directed learners, so on and so forth. And grades undermine that to some degree. They instead substitute these extrinsic motivators, that you're working towards a reward or recognition from others, and you're working to avoid failure or some kind of disciplinary action. So when we talk about the current practice of grades, of using grades, it can be classified as unfair. It also has, I mean, we haven't even gone into this, but there are extensive books and journal articles about how grading on a curve particularly has some racist undertones. So in terms of thinking about this, right, it's not great, to be sure. In terms of what grades correlate with through all of these articles, they definitely correlate better with measures of performance than learning. And that has been shown over and over again. So our question is, what makes my course unique? It's the humans. So maybe we should focus on the humans in those rows and columns. And when I think about rigor, you'll see me on Twitter do this on a regular basis. Do we want our classrooms to have any of those things that are defined in the Merriam-Webster definition of rigor? Probably not. I particularly like the quality of being unyielding or inflexible. I think that sometimes is rigor. So in terms of how we think about treating students as humans. I think until we change the conversation on how we assign grades, that will always be an afterthought. The question that pervades in my mind is this idea that the currency of higher education is grades, right? You have to generally assign a grade at the end of the course. So what can we do, right? Often this grading of student learning has become part of this culture and tradition, and it has been part of this culture and tradition without questioning it at all. So here are some of the things we can do. We could at least have a conversation with our students about what grading is and what it isn't. Grades are a measure of performance. They are not a measure of learning. When you talk about grades, often when we talk about grades, we're talking about some kind of summative assessment. Grades get a little bit more dicey when we're talking about specifications grading, because within that approach, there's an iterative moment, an iterative component that is important, and that does measure learning just a little bit better. And so in terms of when we say that grading is a measurement of performance, that's assuming some kind of summative one-time measurement. We could grade less, we could grade differently, or we could eliminate grades altogether. So what is ungrading? Here are some folks who are considered experts in the field in ungrading. Susan Blum, who edited the book on ungrading, basically thinks about it as a coherent project to undo many of the harmful dimensions of institutional education. I think the fact that grades have assumed such prominence, that it really, you have to work hard to decenter them and deconstruct the grading system when you choose to ungrade. And that is actually a big part of what's required. Jesse Stommel, who is often associated with the word ungrading, doesn't really like the word at all. He, in fact, is like, I don't want to trademark this. I don't want it to be a best set of practices. It's not really just not grading. But I do like this last part where he talks about it as a present participle process that's ongoing, just like learning is. For me, ungrading has been definitely, it's been described as a transformative pedagogical practice and as a mindset, but in my operational definition, it's a set of liberation-oriented pedagogical practices that change the nature of teaching and student evaluation. So for me, I'm talking about it from the critical pedagogy stance. It not only increases intrinsic motivation, but helps students build skills and develop the language around their own assessment and evaluation on how they learn most effectively. It's transformational for instructors because once you start questioning grades, you start questioning everything in the course. And that's where it gets interesting. I feel it's the systematic undoing of grading totally. It's not totally just the opposite of grading. It's more trying to dismantle the system. So the question is, what are we going to choose to do? Right? Should we choose to attend explicitly to these issues of access, inclusiveness, fairness, and equity through employing at least a conversation with our students about their own evaluation of their learning? Or are we going to continue to do things as we have been? There are lots of kinds of ungrading evaluation. You have talked about many of them. Josh Eiler likes to put up a grid of grading practices. I actually, don't tell Josh, but I don't actually like this very much. I don't think it's very helpful in terms of actually understanding, because I don't understand what logistics means for him. But what I really like about this is I like the fact that it talks about less liberating versus more liberating, because there has been a section of folks who have talked about ungrading as if it's easier. It's not an easier version of grading. It's usually harder. So I tend to think about it more in terms of agency versus performance and learning, right? So can we talk about agency, students giving students more agency over their own assessment and evaluation and what that looks like for them in particular. You can disagree with me where things are. It's totally fine. Just because it's on this chart doesn't mean that it's in the right place. If you have thoughts about that, feel free to write me on Twitter or in the comments. I mean, in the chat, sorry. So you've talked about mastery learning. We don't need to talk about that. You've talked about contract grading. We don't need to talk about that either. We don't even need to talk about specs grading because you've spent a long time talking about specs grading. Let's talk about the different kinds of ungrading from what you've talked about already. One of them is self-assessment grading. Pretty much this is where students complete several self-assessments that are reflective in nature throughout the semester. They receive feedback on them, and then a final grade is usually determined either through a student doing a formal final self-assessment or a final conversation with a professor or both. It can be either or both. Depends on who you're talking to about self-assessment. Self-assessment, I think, it's really important to recognize that self-assessment requires skill building. People do not necessarily come to self-assessment and know how to do it just perfectly right at the beginning. And so that is an iterative process that needs to happen as well. And so anytime you're taking on these things, recognize the skill building piece is an important piece. Interview-based grading is kind of the same-ish idea. It's a little bit more an extra, I think of it as more of an extroverted thing because it takes some clarity of thought to do interview-based grading and be able to speak on your feet. However, you could also integrate some reflections into this so that folks can kind of come with some preparation about where they think they are. It allows for feedback in real time. So you meet 3 to 4 times a semester and discuss student progress and how the class is going. The interview can be in person on paper. It can be either way. I've heard people talk about interviews in chats. So it can be done in lots of different formats. But usually an A through F scale is still employed. Peer review, certainly also an A through F, usually has a rubric, usually has some different ways to think about how you would assess other people, often through some kind of framework like RISE or WISE. Both of those are different ways of thinking about how we give feedback. Those, I think this is awesome. I think it is also incredibly important to do, especially in science or STEM classes, because that's part of the nature of what we will have to do. Actually, all classes. What am I talking about? If you review for journals at all, you're going to have to do this at some point. And it is still a skill that you have to learn how to build. And so how to give positive, focused feedback that is interpreted correctly, or at least close to correctly by the person who is reading it, is an incredibly difficult skill to build and is incredibly interesting and important to learn. So it's worth at least thinking about. In terms of my implementations, I focus on metacognition and self-assessment, but up until now, I have still integrated grades. So I have changed from when I wrote the chapter in the book. When I wrote the chapter in the book, it was kind of my first implementation of doing this. And I did it in a way that made really good sense to me, but it could even be a question as to whether I even did ungrading at that point, because I was basically making the students assign themselves their own grades. There was still a feedback component, and my goal in that first implementation was to have a conversation with students. That was the important piece for me. I wanted to make grades no longer a unidirectional kind of monologue. I wanted them to be a dialogue between me and my students. So there's lots of different resources for this. I'm going to show you briefly some things in terms of looking at it. There's the syllabus excerpt that I did. Do I put this in the syllabus anymore? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Often I will if I'm going to implement ungrading formally. If I don't implement ungrading quite as formally, I've learned that while medical schools certainly employ, or professional schools, often this is where my organic 2 students are going, often employ practices that are pass-fail practices or ungrading type practices themselves. They really like organic chemistry to still be a gatekeeping course. And so it becomes a question of whether it actually helps students to know that this is in the syllabus. An example of the class feedback, I used to give the same feedback over and over and over again on papers. And I was like, hey, I can do the class feedback. This was used to generate a conversation because the ungrading corrective part where I was having them do corrections was collaborative work. And so they could converse about this and talk about it like, hey, what did you get on that? And how are you feeling about that? And did she give you, what kind of feedback did she give you? I think that all of those pieces, the conversation is important to me and the collaborative work is important to me. So that's also a part of my ungrading. I also had an ungrading template. This was also combined with kind of an assessment during real time during the exam of whether students felt good about that problem or not. So I did emojis, kind of considered smile sheets, where I had an emoji that was like a smiley face, a meh, versus kind of a meh face, like where it's a straight line or a squiggly line that's straight across, versus an unhappy face, trying to get a sense in real time if students felt like they really knew that stuff or whether they didn't feel good about that stuff that they were putting down, or whether they were kind of like, I don't know. This was still in the place of doing exams. So this is not changing just because you're changing your grading patterns. Does not talk about necessarily changing your assessment patterns, although I think because grading is transformative, often you do. But it is, I was still grading at this point, and grading in a way that was probably more rubric-y, and I was still giving exams. All right, so now I do more of a exam growth self-assessment. I really want to talk about their growth and their learning. I have folks who continually mark themselves as less than I would have marked them. And so I continue to have an issue, particularly with folks who are part of oppressed groups. And the more intersectional your oppressed groups turn out to be, the lower I typically have folks who mark themselves. And that is just one of those things that I think talks to the oppression of the grading system. So sometimes I still kind of look over and say, I would have given you an A on this. You marked yourself as a C. Let's talk about what that is and why you think that was important for you to reflect your time. Because I'm really trying to get them not to tell me what they think I want to hear either, which is part of the self-assessment moment. In terms of ungrading, the focus is on feedback, not on grades. What we've seen is that if you get grades, do comments, feedback, and grades together, that is not a great combination because students typically focus on the grades. They don't focus on the feedback. So if you've been doing that for a while, you might try just giving feedback without a grade and just see how it goes. And you can record a grade or whatever in your Excel spreadsheet, but just maybe thinking about what the feedback is and what that might look like for the students who are trying to understand it. The idea here from Jesse is that pretty much ungrading is this umbrella term. It means that lots of things can fall under ungrading. Basically, for Jesse and for me as well, ungrading is trying to talk about at least having that conversation with students, opening up the assessment and the evaluation so that it is not one-sided anymore, because in fact, it is their learning journey, not ours. We are part of it. We're on it with them, but I think of us more as the Sherpas, the quiet guides in the back, as opposed to like leading the charge and being like, let's understand this for the first time ever. So my research, just as a brief moment, I am researching this. I am doing my dissertation on it, in fact, as part of my PhD work. My research has some different pieces. This looks a little like an SEM moment, a structural equation modeling research model. That's not actually how I intended. I think I'm probably going to do an entirely qualitative dissertation, but this is how I think first. So in terms of communication, I think teaching is communication. These three pieces talk towards the communication. So of course, a little bit further on, I'm going to talk about how ungrading, there's a huge component to ungrading or to any kind of major change in how you're running a classroom that talks about framing. You really have to frame it in a way that shows genuine concern for your students, else they might not buy in. The idea of the collaboration, perhaps between peer student to student, and the reflection piece, which is in fact a component of critical pedagogy as well. We're going to look at that in terms of trust and student agency. Embedded trust here is a little bit different than just the trusting relationship you would build with an instructor. It's a little bit more towards inherent trust that you might have in that assessment. So is this assessment going to teach me life skills, or will it teach me, for future work skills, or something that I know that I'm going to need so that I can move on with my schooling and feel like I really got something. And then maybe some increased equity. We're going to look at those through intersectional power lenses. And then we hope that we will have some indicators of equity. That is a blank box right now because those indicators are actually kind of hard to find in a way that really talks towards the classroom, not school districts or schools. Of course, Michelle has done some work on this, so if you want to put something in the chat, I'd be happy for you to do that. In terms of justice, that's really why I got into grading. I really got into ungrading because it was a social justice issue for me. So hopefully going to get to justice at some point. Some constructs and some ideas of what the intersectional power lenses look like. They're structural, disciplinary, cultural, and interpersonal. In terms of these, we can look at any of the evaluations or assessments through these lenses and kind of get a sense that, in fact, sometimes the power is not entirely in our hands to change things radically. Sometimes we're still stuck with having to give final grades at the end. And that is a structural issue and a disciplinary issue, and perhaps a culture issue of that particular institution. And so in terms of looking at this, we might have to think more broadly than we have before. And for me, framing is, of course, key. You want to build trust in a classroom. These are trust generators from a book by Hammond on culturally responsive teaching. This is really building the trust with instructors. And if you go through the ungrading blogs and literature that exists out there, there is also a piece of building trust with an instructor. I, of course, believe that that's through good communication as well. So that fits into some of these communication pieces. Of course, when you talk about student feedback, this is a little snarky, but I have had students feel like this before. If you don't actually listen and respond to your students' feedback, if they take the time to give it, giving it might start feeling like this cartoon from Bizarro, right? So that you're starting to say, was that even worth my time to fill in that feedback? So my question for you, of course, is, are you ready to ungrade? Perhaps if you want to think about it, I have a reflective worksheet. Part of the reason why I did this and kind of hop, skipped, and jumped through this PowerPoint was because I didn't want to spend forever talking about my implementations of ungrading, but more your questions if you have them, because I think that there is quite a lot to this idea of changing your grading and what that might look like. And there are definitely issues that come up as we implement these different systems of grading and assessment. So your questions and thoughts are very much solicited at this point. Recognize there is, of course, more to this. There's a whole bunch of resources, probably 7 slides on resources that you can look at. And those resources don't include things like trauma-informed pedagogy, pedagogies of care, these kinds of moments that might help give some extra information about how we might approach ungrading in our classes. All right, so I'm ready. Let's talk about your questions.
I have one question for you, I guess.
Sure. Awesome.
So I'm not a part of this group. I came because I was interested in the concept. My name's Cindy Sherman. I'm from Cal State Channel Islands, the School of Business. And
awesome.
So I really am struggling with grading at the moment and feeling like the students didn't get where I wanted them to get to this semester. And
absolutely.
So this is resonating a lot for me. But I think for my colleagues and for the people outside the university, they're going to have a hard time with this. And so I'm wondering how to go about the conversation of resolving sort of the performance perspective that colleges and universities and employers have with this this way of looking at grading.
Yeah, that is a really excellent question, and I appreciate that question. When you talk about the performance levels, I'm going to be honest with you. When you take grades out of the mix as much as you possibly can and center learning, your students generally outperform every expectation you could possibly have, because I've had a lot of students do gangbusters on this. I did this in my Organic 1 class last semester, and I think out of 36 people, I might have given like 25 A's. Like, they just did such beyond high performance that I couldn't even fathom it. Now, unlike my colleagues who believe ungrading is right for every single class you ever go into, I have some scruples, right? Like, my general chemistry 1 students need something to kind of keep them going. So I still have homework. I still have online homework, right? It gives them something throughout the semester that they can feel like, okay, I have something that I can kind of fit into what I know. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to eliminate the goalposts and not replace them with something, right? It takes a lot of trust in you as a teacher if you're going to do that. And the only way I've had that work is if I had multiple like 3/4 to 5/6 of the class follow me from class to class, and then they could train everyone else. Oh, no. You don't need to focus on the grades, right? It takes peer-to-peer training in that case. And so in the case of the business school, I had the same problem with medical schools. Actually had to go to the dean of the medical school to be like, I'm going to try this out. And they made the deal with me that I still had to assign final grades. They did not tell me that I couldn't member check them with my students and say, hey, does this kind of fit what you thought? But it was part of the concessions you make to the system that we're in. And for some students, specs grading really works way better because there's some kind of understanding that I'm either hitting this level or not. Right? I'm getting through the contract. I understand what the barriers are, and I know exactly what levels I have to hit in order to make that happen. So, I'm not going to tell you that if you employ specs training or specs grading for a while, you might be like, hey, I think we could go a little further. But my mantra in teaching is always make the choices you can live with. Right. So,
and I really appreciate you putting more context around that. So thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to meet you. Yes, some students, I'm looking at Allison's, I think that's right. Allison's, yeah, that's right. Good. Excellent. Hi, Allison. Chat moment. Do students respond with anxiety? Yes. Yes, several of them do. If they, especially high performing students, one of the papers I was just reading the other day was a meta-analysis on grades that talked about, and it was a longitudinal, actually it was set up it was a longitudinal study and then a meta-analysis. And both of them said the same thing, which is grades have very minimal effect on high performing students. They have a very minimal positive effect on high performing students and have a very large negative effect on lower performing students, which is where this becomes a bit of an equity issue. And so in terms of thinking about that, right, the focusing on the feedback and not the points, it takes a lot of counseling, especially if you're doing this is the first class they've ever had it in. Because our need to work within the system we know and radically changing that system is incredibly difficult. And so it also takes some grace of like, I understand that you are embedded in the system and you really know that system and you really like that system, which was part of my problem the first time I ever did ungrading. I did it for Organic 2 students who all had bachelor's degrees. Like they had mastered that system and they were kind of really upset with me. I was changing everything on them. And until I had the whole conversation of, look, you have to learn how to self-assess or self-evaluate for performance evaluations. You're going to have to do this your whole life. Like, why not start learning it now? Did they even begin to buy in to what I was talking about? So sometimes it takes different kinds of framing that you don't expect to make this work. I hope that answered your question. Allison, you can, of course, tell me about it if you want to unmute yourself. Yeah, I think, Brenda, in terms of, I'm going backwards on the moment. Allison, you're going to unmute yourself if you feel so inclined. Brenda, I think the soft approach to ungrading, you can do any baby steps, like any approach to ungrading works, right? If that's what you can live with, do that. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. It gets to be when you look at like the ungrading book, the ungrading chapters for most of the people in the book, they've been doing it for like 20 years. So they really like they're further along the line. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You gotta start somewhere, right? Like they're not talking about it from like point A. They're talking about it from like point omega, right? If you're not even in the alphabet anymore. So like make the choices you can live with. And anything is basically better than traditional grading.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Of course. When all students present, when I discuss grading, I discuss grading specifically with students by themselves. So I make individualized appointments. Does grading help? Yes, it helps a lot. Part of my thing is folks always ask me, does anyone get an F? And I'm like, of course they get an F. I can't deal with what I don't have. And there will always be students who do not choose my class over anything else, or around everything else that they're dealing with in their lives. And I'm super flexible on deadlines and all kinds of other things because I choose to be. That's not part of ungrading, but that's what I choose. And I really try to treat students as humans. They don't have to give me excuses about getting, deadline, like you need a deadline exception, here it is. But the truth, and I, like right now with my organic 2 students, just before I go on, I'm having them tell me the deadlines. I'm making them like actually go through the syllabus and annotate it and be like, hey, I think my deadline should be here. But in terms of the Fs, yeah, I'm always going to give Fs. There's always going to be people who don't prioritize or turn in stuff. And I literally can't grade what I don't have. My averages have been about the same. Unfortunately, I just have more A's and F's, which is telling you something about the statistical distribution of grades to begin with. Like the normal curve is not necessarily an awesome way to measure grades, but we can go into statistical analysis later if you want to go wild and crazy. Okay. How do you get student buy-in? Framing. Julia, that's an excellent question. How do I get student buy-in? Are students receptive initially? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. They all have bachelor's degrees. They really aren't. I have no idea why I started with that class. Like, Lord, that was crazy and wild. But yeah, it's about framing. It's about talking about how these skills are important in your life and how you're going to be building them in a way that we can talk about what's going on together. My students almost always tell me now that the skills that they're learning in my class are so fundamental to what they're going to do in every other class that they can't even imagine not having my class, which is a great feeling, but also like, I had you as a sophomore. That's a little, okay. Especially the ones who told me that after their bachelor's. I was like, you have a bachelor's. I am really sorry that this is, okay. I'm not going to get into that. Okay. How does one resolve the need from the university to see a performance level that would include this process? Oh, I already answered that, Cindy. Thank you for that question again. Okay. Did I get everyone's questions?
You got all the questions that are currently in the chat.
Okay, fantastic. Are there any other questions?
I've been watching.
Thank you, Renee. Any other questions that y'all would like to ask? How much time? It's more consuming, Carlos, at least at the beginning. And the reason why it's so time consuming is this exact thing that I said earlier, which is it is actually incredibly difficult unless you've been a manager before and have like some training on this. It is actually really incredibly difficult to write positive, constructive feedback that students interpret correctly. It is rough, especially when you're talking about a skill as opposed to content. It is, you're trying really hard to be like, this is not a personal attack. This is not anything that has to do with you. There's still a lot of fear of failure in classes. So if you even talk about like, this was not necessarily where it needed to be, immediately the bells start going off. I failed. I did this, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of counseling that happens along with this. So in terms of looking at the time is upfront, really consuming. Once you get used to it, it gets way easier. And it actually pays dividends in the end. But I'm saying that 7, 8. I think I'm almost 3 years in, so 9 semesters in. I have a different perspective than I did my first semester where I was like, this is a lot of work. and Courtney might be able to tell you something about that as well.
Clarissa, it's Peter. I asked a question about UC Santa Cruz experience. Does anybody remember that? UC Santa Cruz, I seem to recall, had some similar ungrading thing. And I'm just wondering if there were any lessons from what they experienced.
UCSC had narrative evaluation at some point, right? But it predates my time, so I don't actually know.
Okay, ancient history, huh?
Well, it kind of reminds me, Peter, of the Don Rag. So I live right by Santa Fe. St. John's College does what they call the Don Rags. Don Rags are from Cambridge, early Oxford kind of moments, where it's called a Don Rag because the Dons would rag on you. So basically, this isn't meant to be a horrible thing. That's just the nature of that's the origin of the name. It's not how it's actually supposed to go. Teachers get into a conference room. They've talked about where your growth edges are and where your real positive strengths are. They have a conversation with you over an hour. The first 20 minutes, you're not supposed to speak because you're just thinking about what they've said to you and trying to be deeply reflective. And then you get some time. They do a little break, and then you're supposed to give some feedback to them. I was like, this is the pinnacle of ungrading. This is amazing. Like, this would be awesome. And then I talked to people who had actually gone to St. John's, and they were like, they still give you a grade in the end, and they don't ask you about that grade. So from the student point of view, it felt very much like those students, it was like a socioeconomic split between those who paid full tuition versus not. The lower grades were with the lower socioeconomic, which may or may not be true, but that was the student perception. And that's not, I was like, they didn't even member check with you, like whether that captured what you thought. They were like, no. I was like, it's a great system until it failed. So it's an awesome idea. I would love to see the member checking end of that. But that's kind of where I am with that. Okay. Yeah, it was awesome. All right.
Chris, I have a question. When you discuss these different skills and things with students, I can see my freshmen just not even knowing where to go with this.
Right.
So how often do you meet with them or build these skills before you actually discuss a final evaluation?
Yeah, with freshmen and freshman-oriented classes. Now, admittedly, I have a mix all the way through. So I'll always have like some people who have a degree and something else, and then I'll always have some adult learners, and then always. Right. So it depends on context, right? Context really matters in this case. But if you have 18-year-olds who, are barely coming in and kind of trying to understand what's going on, I would probably make it a much more scaffolded thing.
Yeah.
So I would definitely have those conversations and start talking to them about, okay, this is something that we're going to work on as a skill. And we're going to keep on iterating throughout the semester, but I would definitely be grading on the back end.
Yeah.
To kind of say, does this match what we thought together? Right. And maybe at most, that's what I do for my Gen Chem 1 students. I average my grade. Now, I don't grade like I used to. I used to go through and be like, I have 100-point scale, and therefore I will take off a point every time you do XYZ, until I realized that was a horrible way to grade, because we can't be that accurate at all. I'm not that accurate between students. I'm not that accurate between other people who teach the same course, right? Just like, we are not that accurate. So now it's more of a, this looks kind of like an A, this looks kind of like a B, this looks kind of like a C. And they can, of course, debate me on that. That's totally fine. But then it starts to be a little bit better in terms of their own growth potential. They can really talk. I can be like, I want you to focus on what you did in terms of growth.
Yeah.
I don't really care about what you think your accuracy to some standard is.
Got it.
And that starts to be that's a radical conversation in itself,
Yeah.
right? That's the moment where you're like, what?
Right. Sure.
And
Yeah.
so that conversation is worth having no matter how you have it. And even if it doesn't factor into their grades exactly yet.
Okay. That's a good answer. Thanks.
Welcome. All right.
Got one from Katie in the chat.
Katie, all right. Is there a good way to recognize and account for students suggesting a grade you don't agree with? Yeah. So generally, if they grade themselves lower than I would have graded them, I give them the higher grade. And I say, we need to talk about what grading has, let's have a conversation in a narrative. And that conversation can be through narratives about why you gave yourself that grade. Why is it that you think that was the grade you deserved in this case? Generally, that conversation goes a lot better than the other conversation, which is people who think they are stellar, who are not turning in the best work. And turning in the best work, right? That's still against the standard. You could have a conversation about that and what that means, and whether that's warranted or not. But in terms of thinking about the standards, right? I tend to, when I first implemented this, I was like, just give yourself a grade that you think you earned. And then I had some people who were like, I'm amazing in organic chemistry. And I'm like, most of what you got on the exam was wrong. You have feedback on every line. So I was like, we need to talk. If you think that my question is confusing or that my feedback is confusing, I would like you to do some references for that. Because basically the idea there was that I get feedback in peer reviews all the time. When I get peer reviewed on a journal, I get feedback I don't agree with. I don't like either. So what do I have to do? I have to write the editor and I have to give some actual references as to why I am right. So at the beginning, I was like, yeah, we're going to do that. Your book could be one of them. Find another one. I don't mind if it's a Chem RX moment, but you're going to find something that tells me how what you're doing is really awesome, and warrants that A. Am I that struck anymore? No, I've grown. And that's important, but I still sometimes pull that out for particularly folks who just feel entitled to the A, no matter how much work they put in. So that's the way worse conversation, if we're talking Katie. The other one is usually like, oh, wow, you think I'm really that great? I'm like, yes, of course you're that great. Who told you weren't? Right. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting, Michelle. Can you talk some more about your comment with your conversation on faculty? I'd love to hear more about that.
I can try. I feel like, I think there's a lot of assumptions made about what faculty understand about teaching and learning. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when we just jump right into a conversation of ungrading, it requires a little bit of backtracking and just understanding, some basic, really instructional skills. Like, what's the difference between surface learning and deep learning? What do we really mean by critical thinking? And what is formative assessment versus summative assessment? And all of that may already be under someone's belt, but I think if it's not, those skills can really be helpful because then they become tools that they can apply to their course. So thinking about what is learning and how can you use the language of learning in your class, and how can you really ensure that your students understand that your assignments are designed to help them achieve certain skills along the way.
Right.
And I just feel like that might be a better or more accessible place to start the conversation for some faculty.
Absolutely. And I am not a teaching and learning. I mean, disclaimer. I do teaching and learning stuff through these talks. I'm interested in teaching and learning, but I do not work in a teaching and learning center. I have come to this from a point of view of let's talk about I have a longevity in teaching and can actually tell myself most of these things. The younger me was very tied to grades, very tied to traditional grades. And I thought I did it all just right. And I was a rock star for doing it. And then I, progressively figured out how wrong I was. But it's the formative. I have a hypothesis that folks who are employing formative assessment and reflective writing or reflective writing and or project-based learning or problem-based learning quite possibly come to ungrading or at least changes in grading more easily than folks who haven't necessarily, and that talks to what you were just saying, Michelle, and
also that
piece.
what you just said, Clarissa, about, the effect of grading on you, sharing our own stories with our students. I think that's a really powerful way to get buy-in with students, because like if you feel that way, then it really opens their eyes and also starts to foster that trust and connection a lot.
Right. Absolutely. And I spend a lot of time saying, and here was how much I didn't do this way back when. I've grown a lot over 20 years. I still look forward to growing more, but yeah, it's been a while. But thank you for that. That was very helpful.
I'm going to ask one more question.
Awesome.
Because Megan had to leave and left me as host, so host privilege.
Woo!
So for somebody who's interested but not ready to go too far, what would you suggest as like a baby step?
Having the conversation. Begin the conversation on what grades are and what they measure, because a lot of students tie grading their grades to their self-worth, certainly to their academic self-worth. And we see a lot of studies on this. Certainly it affects academic self-efficacy and all kinds of other moments as well, but trying to unknot that tie to academic self-worth, that grades are not a measure of your learning or who you are or whatever. They are really more a measure of your performance on that one thing at this time. And part of learning is failing, and that's totally fine. That piece, I think, is such an important piece. If we all had that conversation, we would be so much more awesome in terms of stuff, in terms of having this conversation at all.